On the eve of World War II, new research methods were finding that most Canadians were malnourished. When Canada entered the war, the federal government took unprecedented steps to influence what Canadians ate, so the country would not only have strong soldiers abroad, but also reliable workers at home. Joining us now for more, Ian Mosby. He is author of Food Will Win the War. That title sums up the whole book, Ian, so we don't have to talk anymore. There you go. No, it's good to have you here at TVO.
Thanks so much.
Let's just, I'm going to start actually by just reading an excerpt from the book. Here we go. A number of common themes ran through much of the Canadian wartime writing about nutrition. At the most basic level was a strong connection between good nutrition and patriotic citizenship. The war effort, Canadians were regularly told, depended on healthy workers and soldiers. Canadians who refused healthy food were, quote, fifth columnists and were committing acts of, quote, wartime sabotage. Or, as the title of one Saturday Night article put it, Canada's faulty diet is Adolf Hitler's ally. This is, I got to tell you, I've never heard about this angle of World War II before. Read a ton of stuff on the war, and you know, this whole notion of how food will help you win the war, you know, is kind of a revelation. Where'd you get onto this?
I actually started it looking into the origins of Canada's food guide. I'm a historian of science and medicine, and so I was wondering, you know, where did this food guide start? And it brought me back to the original food guide, which was in 1942, and it was called Canada's Official Food Rules. And almost immediately I was hooked on, you know, what was going on in wartime that the government was so concerned about nutrition, malnutrition, and the population's health.
And the notion that Canadians would be malnourished, like not just didn't eat well or eat badly, but malnourished.
Well,
was that a revelation?
You know, not just malnourished. 60% of Canadians, according to these government scientists, were malnourished, and so it was this, you know, massive public effort to solve this crisis. And there was a concern at the beginning of the war, especially because, you know, when war was first declared, the first round of volunteers, the first 50,000 Army volunteers, a shocking number were rejected for medical reasons, upwards of 40%. And so people were scrambling to figure out why were so many young men and women, young men in particular, being rejected for military service. And nutrition experts sort of came out and said, well, we've been telling you, 60% of Canadians are malnourished, and this is the reason.
Go ahead, go into that. What were the reasons?
Well, part of what was going on was Canada was coming out of this, you know, the Great Depression. Canadians themselves had long been saying, you know, we're hungry, we don't have enough money for food, let alone clothing and shelter. And so for a lot of ordinary Canadians, this made sense for their experience. You know, the Depression was hard times and hard living, and the idea that they were malnourished wasn't a real surprise. But when nutrition experts started to conduct these major national surveys, the scale of it was far different than anyone had expected. This idea that 60% of Canadians were malnourished, you know, was really shocking. Now, one of the things that I should point out is, you know, this was a problematic figure. It's a figure that when you look back on it, they weren't arguing that 6% of Canadians were, you know, suffering from rickets or scurvy.
Yeah.
No, they were arguing that 60% of Canadians were not eating enough to be at their peak potential.
Well, and if you're about to go into a world war, you'd like to be at your peak potential.
Exactly.
So what did the government have up its sleeve?
Well, one of the first things that it did was it started this massive national education campaign. And so, you know, these nutrition professionals who in the 1930s had been really minor figures, you know, even in public health circles in Canada, suddenly became, you know, these major public figures who were being asked their opinion on everything. And they designed a number of programs, you know, the heart of which was Canada's Official Food Rules. This set of 6 rules to tell you exactly what foods to eat to stay healthy. And the slogan of the food rules sort of summed up what they wanted to do. It's eat right, feel right, Canada needs you strong. And so the entire premise of the food rules was we do need, especially Canada's rising generation, the next generation of soldiers, to be at their maximum fighting potential, their maximum productive potential.
Okay, so on the one hand, you've got the government saying we need you to be healthy, eat right, feel right, etc. On the other hand, it's wartime, and the government has to start rationing everything.
Yes.
So how do you mix those two priorities?
Well, one of the fascinating things I discovered during the course of this research is World War II is looked back on as a time of austerity when it comes to food, especially because it's the first war where Canadians had coupon rationing. Massive, widespread price controls are introduced. I went in expecting it to be Canadians eating less of everything, but the reality is there was more food to go around than there had been in a generation.
Why was that?
Canadians had come out of this Great Depression, and suddenly during the war, there's jobs for everyone. Unemployment virtually disappears overnight. Wages begin to go up. These new war industries that are forming are better paying jobs than the previous jobs before. And also most of the agricultural production in Canada was for export during this period. And one thing that the war did was suddenly export markets got cut off. Canada was no longer shipping grain to France, for instance, because France was occupied by the enemy. And so suddenly there was enough food to go around for everyone. People had more money to buy food. And so when you look at meat rationing, for instance, one of the reasons why the government had to start rationing meat was because Canadians were eating more meat than they ever had before. Meat consumption went through the roof. And so they had to sort of restrain it so that there wouldn't be shortages because Canadians were eating so much meat.
And how did Canadians take the news that the government wanted to ration their food?
Surprisingly, once again, I thought Canadians would be really opposed to this idea of the government stepping in and telling them what to eat, what not to eat. But in fact, polls showed prior to the introduction of rationing that most Canadians wanted rationing to be introduced because not only did they feel that they weren't making enough sacrifices for the war. The war really hit Canada much differently than it hit Europe. It wasn't as though Canada was being directly invaded. But also Canadians started to feel that as consumption was going up, as food consumption, meat, butter, sugar, all of those sorts of things, shortages did begin to show up. And Canadians felt that they weren't getting their fair share. Some people were cheating. Some people were hoarding. Shopkeepers were saving, the best cuts of meat or scarce goods for specific customers. And they wanted the government to step in and make everything fair. And so this term began to be thrown around, this idea of equality of sacrifice. The idea that I'm willing to make a sacrifice, but everyone has to make the same kind of sacrifice.
How did the government police food rationing at the time?
This is kind of the fascinating thing. Food rationing is this massive, unprecedented government intervention into people's kitchens, into their everyday lives. And to actually police it effectively, they would have had to hire, an entire, new military or new police force to enforce all of these regulations. And they couldn't do that. They needed men and women to send overseas. And so, in fact, they began to enlist ordinary Canadians and Canadian women in particular to be sort of an informal police force of rationing.
How'd they do it?
And they did it by, partially through sort of propaganda appeals, this idea of, if you see something wrong, you need to report it. So if you're...
Report it to whom?
Report it to the Wartime Prices and Trade Board,
Okay.
which is this huge national organization, a government board that's formed to sort of oversee the wartime state-controlled economy. And the government really has taken control of the production and distribution of nearly all foodstuffs, much of Canada's war industries, of its non-war industries as well.
And did that really happen? Like, if somebody sees Mrs. Smith down the street sneaking a few pads of butter too many, they got reported to the board?
They did, in fact.
It did happen.
People called the board. There was hundreds of calls per month, and in fact, one of the things the government did is they organized these groups called Women's Regional Advisory Committees, and it was women volunteers who sort of got together every week or every month and talked about, how do we make rationing work? How do we make sure everyone's following the rules? And some of these committees were really committed. For instance, in Montreal, one of the Women's Regional Advisory Committees actually formed a snitch line you could call. So if you see somebody, selling a pat of butter for too much or holding back food that they should be selling, you could call this anonymous snitch line. And hundreds of people called the snitch line.
Anybody go to jail?
People went to jail.
People went to jail.
People went to jail for shopping on the black market, for hoarding. Now, a lot of this was, if it was a minor infraction, you'd get a warning. You'd be let off easily. But you know, if you were doing a major infraction, if you were hoarding meat, or if you were, you know, running a black market ring, you could definitely go to jail, and people did.
Okay, the war ends, 1945 VE Day, 70 years ago this week, and the government starts removing all of those rules around rationing. How did people respond then?
People, once again, I was very surprised by this. People were actually quite angry that rationing stayed on for quite a while. In fact, meat rationing was removed for a while in 1944 because there was plenty of meat to go around. They didn't need to do it. They actually reintroduced meat rationing after the war ended. And rationing stayed in place until a few years after the war ended. And the same was true of price control. And price control was really important because during the First World War, one of the major problems was the price of food increased. It more than doubled.
See that up there? What are we looking at there?
We're looking at a children's chocolate bar boycott. And this is part of the problem. You know, people's experience after the First World War was massive inflation in prices. And they saw during the Second World War, if the government stepped in and set maximum price ceilings, prices wouldn't go up and people could afford more food. And so as soon as the government starts removing price ceilings, one of the first price ceilings they removed that people got upset about was milk. They actually increased the price of milk. And suddenly there's protests around the country. Women are marching on their local MP's office. They're marching on their local grocery store. They begin to sign petitions. They begin in Ottawa, a group of housewives form a boycott committee to boycott any stores selling milk over this increased price. And in fact, this begins to increase and ramp up during the course of the post-war period as more and more price controls are removed. Food prices begin to skyrocket, and women begin to form organizations. One of the most prominent ones is called the Housewives Consumer Association. And it's a massive organization across the country. They launch boycotts, marches, protests, including that colorful protest of the children boycotting the 8-cent chocolate bar.
8 cents for a chocolate bar. I mean, if you put inflation and everything into account.
Well, the day before it was 5 cents.
Oh,
so.
well, that's ridiculous then. That's ridiculous. 1948, the Ottawa Citizen published a suggested shopping list for low-income families. It was created by a guy named L.B. Pett, director of the Nutrition Division of the Department of National Health and Welfare, and here's how the government describes it. The list outlined a weekly menu for a typical family of 5 based on a food budget of $16.36 per week, roughly 15.5 cents per meal. The Pett diet, as critics later dubbed it, was heavy on starches and root vegetables, including 16.5 pounds of potatoes, 11.5 loaves of bread, and including little in the way of frills. It offered for no spices or coffee, while recommending quantities of meat, butter, sugar, and tea well below wartime ration allotments, 50% less in the case of meat. Although austere, even by wartime standards, this shopping list was not unusual. Nutrition experts working for governments and social services agencies had been long producing similar lists, but social conditions were, by then, also changing rapidly. That's how you wrote it in the book. What did the public think of this new menu?
Well, and this is sort of, you know, I use this example to mark the sort of wartime change in public attitudes. The public, you know, Pett became a laughingstock. And during the war, he was this major public figure. He was the author of Canada's official food rules. He was often interviewed, you know, for his opinion on how Canadians can eat, you know, have a healthy diet. And then suddenly after the war, he's seen as sort of a toady, a government toady, justifying the rapidly rising price of food, justifying the removal of you know, wartime controls. And people begin to say, you know, we didn't fight in a war for no reason. We fought in a war because we want to you know, live better after the war's over than when it started. And in fact, people were eating less by 1948 than they were eating at the height of the war. Food consumption during the war went up to unprecedented levels, and in fact, it wouldn't reach those levels again until the late 1950s. And part of this is because of inflation. When price control was removed, when rationing was removed, Canadians suddenly could afford less things like meat, less things like butter, less of the rationed items that they become accustomed to. And so the fact that the Pett diet recommended 50% less meat, a lot of Canadians saw this as a slap in the face for, you know, the sacrifices that they'd been making during the war, both overseas and on the home front.
So this is when Canada starts to create, I guess post-war time we're talking now, the creation of the welfare state comes in. After everything that the public had gone through in World War II, why didn't the government of the day create, for example, guaranteed food programs, that kind of thing?
Yeah, and this is a question I had, because in the United States they did. You know, they create a national school lunch program. They create a food stamp program. And the same in Britain. They create a national free school lunch program, a number of nutritional programs. And in Canada they don't do this. And part of this I found during my research was there was a lot of political infighting among nutrition experts themselves. A lot of the scientists who conducted these surveys that found 60% of Canadians were malnourished, some of them thought that the government should step in and begin to redistribute wealth to make sure that all Canadians could afford sufficient foods. Others thought it was Canadians' own fault that they weren't eating the right foods. Mothers in particular, they would argue, weren't properly educated. And so these were sort of two streams among nutrition experts. One side arguing for more government intervention, the other side arguing for better public education in nutrition. And so one side won. The side arguing for education won. That became Canada's official nutrition policy, was the food rules, Canada's food guide, but not a national school lunch program, for instance, not something like food stamps. And this would have, really long-term effects to today.
Look at that monitor over my shoulder one more time, because we're going to show you, and yes, in case you don't know, this is before the women's liberation movement came along. Thank you, Mrs. Consumer. What's going on in this poster?
Well, this is, part of the government's, the success of their food programs during the war really required women in particular to do a lot of the heavy lifting. Women did 85% of the shopping during this period. They did almost all of the cooking. And so the success of these programs really required ordinary women to do a lot of extra work. So Mrs. Consumer was the government's name for these women who were ensuring that rationing went smoothly, ensuring that the price control program was effective. And women actually began to embrace Mrs. Consumer. But one of the problems was, for the government at least, is as the post-war protests showed, they also felt that it wasn't only their obligations, to be Mrs. Consumer, saving, eating only what she needs, rationing. She also felt that she had a number of rights, rights to affordable food, rights to enough money to be able to buy this food. And so this is where this post-war consumer protest movement begins to emerge.
Interesting. Ian, you've put it all together in a beautiful book called Food Will Win the War. And I guess it did. The politics, culture, and science of food on Canada's home front. Ian Mosby, it's good of you to visit us at TVO tonight. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.